In this second video on the history of American recreation, we'll look at the period after the Civil War, from Reconstruction through the end of the 19th century, the Victorian Age. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, public interest in sports exploded, in part because of the booming economy of the late 19th century. In the growing sport of baseball, a split occurred between those charging admission and getting paid, which of course some cite as the first organized professional baseball, and those who insisted on playing the sport just for fun. In time, a national league of professional players was formed, and soon another league, the American League, was created, both vying for a paying audience. During the Victorian Age, a number of other leagues also played and tried to compete with the national American leagues, but had little success overall. It was during this time that both the National American Leagues banned African American players, which led to, inevitably, an African American League. The popularity of baseball in the late 19th century led to the first softball, which was an alternative game first invented for women, but was soon played as a social activity by both men and women. By the late 19th century, the spread of college and club sports and the fear that professionalism would corrupt sports led to the creation of the American Athletic Union, or the AAU, to promote what they saw as an amateur ideal in sports, fair competition just for the joy of the game. It did everything from promote physical fitness in elementary schools to coordinating with the International Olympic Committee. At first, the AAU banned female sports, but by the early 20th century it backtracked and allowed competition in a few sports for women, such as swimming. Also, after the Civil War, college athletes competing in versions of mob football and rugby-style football, which we'd mentioned earlier, they began to debate, which version of their sport was correct, and they ultimately sort of went with the rugby-style football. Walter Camp, shown here on the left, is now considered the father of American football when he proposed a line of scrimmage with individual plays and down and distance requirements. As baseball and football grew, a new sport of basketball was invented at Springfield College in Massachusetts by James Naismith. With the winter storm outside, Naismith put up 2 peach baskets in an indoor gym in 1891 and told his students the purpose was to get the ball into the opponent's basket. Now, this led at first to a brawl with tackling, and so Naismith quickly revised the rules prohibiting carrying the ball or tackling. The new sport quickly grew in popularity in colleges, and the first public game was held in 1892. This is a picture of Naismith on the left down there. The Young Men's Christian Association, or you may know it as the YMCA, promoted basketball, which helped spread the sport. And later, the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF in World War I, frequently played the sport, which of course spread it to Europe. A brief professional basketball league began operations in 1898, but it didn't last very long, only a few years. During the late 19th century, the sport of tennis grew in the United States. The sport had roots back to the 12th century in Europe, where it was played on lawns. In tennis, women players competed as often as men. In fact, a woman, Mary Outerbridge, introduced the sport to the United States after seeing it played in Bermuda. The sport grew in popularity quickly, especially among the wealthy during the Victorian Age. The first United States Open tennis tournament was held in 1881, a few years after the British had established a tournament at Wimbledon. Undoubtedly, the wealth of the late industrial age also helped the rapid spread of golf. The sport had roots back to Europe and is often considered to have been invented in Scotland. There is some evidence that American colonists played a version of the sport, but it was in the Victorian era that the sport as we know it exploded in popularity, first in Europe and then spreading to America. Given the wealth of the late 19th century, many of the upper classes continue to separate themselves from the lower classes, a key ingredient in the social rules of the Victorian Age, of course. It is during this period that the wealthy formed country clubs or yacht clubs. They would include golf and tennis and, as I say, yachting. By the Victorian era, the idea of a wealthy sportsman participating in such leisure activities as organized fox or pheasant hunting with dogs had developed. Wealthy industrialists and their families would take months-long vacations to Europe, emulating the nobility there. Second homes for vacations became popular. With the growing diversity of immigration, the socializing among many of the lower classes revolved around their own ethnic group. Among many of the lower classes, bare-knuckled boxing remained popular, a sign of manliness and toughness, it was thought. Many of the lower and middle classes enjoyed the spread of circuses. Forms of circuses had existed for centuries, but in the late 19th century the growth of cities and industrialization undoubtedly contributed. Early circuses had existed in the early national era, but after the Civil War, the Ringling Brothers purchased P.T. Barnum's operations, which had been a competing operation, and created the first Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, which they soon dubbed the greatest show on earth. Similar to the growth of the circus was the popularity of Wild West shows. The closing of the American frontier with the settlement of the Great Plains and the last Indian Wars created a nostalgia for the West and a perceived romanticism of the era. The lower middle classes also enjoyed going to some of the amusement parks in such places as Coney Island in New York or Atlantic City in Maryland. There one could ride one of the new so-called roller coasters. With the growth of large cities in the late industrial age of the Victorian era, the first significant urban zoos began to develop. The growth of cities had led to a demand for some areas of nature. As cities grew around earlier cemeteries, which often had grown trees and bushes, the cemeteries became like urban parks. City leaders, recognizing the demand for a respite from the bustle of the city, began to establish deliberate urban parks throughout the city. Now, in time, some cities began to display animals in these parks as another reminder of nature. The first zoos, therefore, were often consciously built to resemble nature as much as they could and draw attention away from the blight of the industrial city. As the wealth of the industrial age grew and the ability to communicate and travel improved, the first modern Olympics was organized in Athens in 1896. It included competitions in 9 sports, reviving an event that had extended back to the ancient world. The sports included track, wrestling, weightlifting, fencing, gymnastics, swimming, shooting, bicycling, and tennis. In 1896, the United States won the most gold medals. By 1924, the International Olympic Committee had been created, and they began to organize the Olympics every 4 years, and they also held the first Winter Olympics in France. Bicycling in the Victorian age of the late 19th century became a popular rage for both men and women. Earlier forms of a bicycle had dated to Europe in the early 19th century, but in the 1870s a version with a big front wheel allowed for faster travel. This was unsafe, however, and by the end of the 19th century, new improved roadsters were common, with styles for both men and women. Theater in the United States exploded as the late 19th century ended. Railroads allowed production companies to move around, and many small towns began to build their own permanent theaters to accommodate them. The spread of electricity in the bigger towns also made productions more elaborate and popular, with lighting and sound vastly improved. The spread of one type of theater was particularly challenging to the morality-based Victorian culture, the spread of vaudeville. Vaudeville arose from short novelty acts and singers that would earlier entertain the audiences at plays, between the plays. Vaudeville embraced more off-color and bawdy entertainment, often with sexual innuendo and lowbrow humor. It appealed to the lower classes, which caused the Victorian elite to complain that it was undermining American culture. This concludes the second video on the history of American recreation from the Civil War through the late 19th century Victorian age.